Okay, hello everyone. I hope this is working now. We've had some issues here, but I think we're on anyway. It seems to be. Do you want to check everything's okay at that from what you could see? Right. So apologies once more, but good evening and welcome to our October talk. Our speaker tonight is a local man hailing, not surprisingly given the content of tonight's talk, from Auchtermuchty. His subject is the story of John White and Son Weighing Machines Limited. Educated initially at the local primary school, he then attended Dollar Academy before completing his formal education at Edinburgh University, securing his degree in economics, accounting, and business management. He joined the family firm in 1965 and became a director in 1972 before becoming managing director between 1996 and 2017. Today, he remains a director of the firm and also is the honorary life president. Ted recently retired from the board of the industry trade body, the UK Weighing Federation. Our speaker is both interested and active in conservation and is a life member and former chairman of Cooper and North Fife Preservation Society, along with being a founding trustee of Auchtermuchty Heritage. Ted is also a governor at Dollar Academy. For relaxation away from weighty matters, Ted enjoys curling, photography, and folk music. Our speaker tonight can boast of 56 years intimate experience of his subject. And so I give you Ted White. Thank you, Ted. If you want to share your screen.
Thank you very much, Neil. Is that it coming up now?
That's that's the sort of the edit view, as it were.
Okay. Is that the main screen now?
No, that's still the edit one. Remember, we had to do the share entire screen.
Okay.
You maybe want to try that again.
Yeah. That should be it coming up now.
So if you bring up your PowerPoint.
If I can do that. I've got a funny screen here. If I can exit full screen there and bring up a PowerPoint, which is there. Is that it coming up now?
That's it. That's it. Yep. So it's all yours, Ted. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Neil, as the chair of the Market Heritage. Very delighted to be able to give this presentation about the history of John White and Son, Scotland's oldest family business. Now, apologies to some of you who are members of Market Heritage that might already have seen this talk when I gave it to Cooper Heritage. Since then, I've added a few bits and pieces, and since it's entirely unscripted, you may learn some new things tonight as well. So here we are. John White & Son is Scotland's oldest family business. And we're based in Auchtermuchty. Now, I wonder, those of you, the older generation, will perhaps associate this gentleman with Auchtermuchty. But if you're of a younger disposition, perhaps it'll be these two who stayed in Auchtermuchty when they went to school. So we're very happy to have musical associations here in Auchtermuchty. Now, this is a talk about John White & Son, which is a family business, and actually it's in the White family for 8 generations. So here we show the family tree going back to the start of the business in the early part of the 18th century. At the top, you'll see John White, number 1. That's my 5 times great-grandfather. And down through the generations, it goes, and it's highlighted. The ones in boxes are the ones who were associated with the business. So it comes right down through the generations until my generation, which is the 8th generation, and I'm the one in the bottom right-hand corner. So it's a long running story, and that's the family tree down through the generations. Now, we're all about weighing. That's what we do best, although we have done other things in the past. And weighing is an ancient and honourable craft. If you go back to the start of the Bible in Genesis chapter 23, they obviously had weighing machines then. Abraham was using a weighing machine to weigh out some silver. And accurate weighing is a mark of civilization because it ensures that there's a just transaction between 2 parties where you're measuring things by weight. And the equal arm beam, which is the most basic form of weighing, has been in use since Egyptian times. So if we go back and look at 2000 BC in ancient Egypt, in this picture, you'll see there's an equal arm beam, and there's the chap just underneath it. And that's the type of beam that they were using in ancient Egypt. Move forward to 550 BC in Cyrene, which is modern-day Libya, and there we have another equal arm beam being used. King Archibald II weighing out a cargo of silphium. So again, the equal arm beam being used. Moving forward to a French marketplace scene in the 15th century. And it's quite so easy to see, but on the right-hand side of the lower part of the picture, they're weighing out produce in an equal arm beam. And that was in France. Now, we move to Auchtermuchty in 1715, and we have an equal arm beam. And this is one that was made by the first John White. He put his name on one side, and on the other side, he put the year, 1715. And we still have that, and we show it at exhibitions locally. And it still works, and it's still accurate, 300 and many years later. So if we go back through some of the historical records that refer to Whites, in the old statistical account near the end of the 18th century, there were 7 blacksmiths in Auchtermuchty. One of them was Whites. Into the 19th century, there were still 7 blacksmiths, and Leighton records in 1840 that Whites was one of them. 1857, a good reference this, a smith, i.e. a blacksmith, noted for the excellence of the beams and scales which he makes, which are in consequence known throughout the greater part of the county. So the produce of the firm was well known then. 1862 identifies the firm by name, John White & Sons Beam and Scale Makers. 65, a beam making business. 82, a scale beam and weighing machine factory. And 95, weighing machine factory and iron foundry. I'll mention the iron foundry later on. Now, this is an interesting document, one of the early documents that we do have in our possession. This actually marks the first sale to the whisky industry. Now, in those days, there was a distillery in Auchtermuchty called the Catalogue Distillery, which was opened in 1829. And Alexander Bonthron, who was the distiller, on the right-hand side, halfway down the page, on the 16th of August, 1842, he bought a box end beam 3.5 feet long, and it cost him £1.10. And the whisky industry is still a very important industry for John White and Son today. So it started way back then in the first half of the 19th century. And here's a picture of the workforce at the end, towards the end of the 19th century, around about 1890. And that photograph is taken outside the factory. And on the left, you'll see Provost Andrew White, and on the right, Henry White, JP, who's my grandfather. And the little boy in the centre with the kilt was an uncle who was born in 1884. So we reckon he's about 6 years old there. So that's a group. You'll see that the family dog was also featured in the photograph. And there's 2 or 3 other members of the White family were in the workforce at that time. And here's a catalogue taken from about 1895. And you'll see it has an illustration. It's not an accurate representation, but it's in principle showing that the factory consisted of 2 bays. And the one on the left is the one where the photograph would have been taken. And the one on the right was actually in behind. But it shows the 2 beams of the factory. And this is my grandfather. So he was the one that really expanded the business in Victorian times. And the business was well connected because he married the daughter of another iron founder in Coatbridge. In fact, the families must have been really well connected because a brother and sister married a sister and brother. So my great aunt married a member of the same family. And the other day I came across another photograph which looked quite similar, and I realised that he was another Victorian industrialist from Fife. Now most of you will recognise this gentleman. That's Andrew Carnegie, who made his fortune in America. And here's a family group taken around about the same time, 1895. My grandfather and his second wife, my grandmother, and all his children. And 3 of them actually worked in the business. Most of the other ones died quite young, but 3 of them worked in the business, my 2 uncles and my father. Again, the family dog in the photograph. And as I said, my grandfather really expanded the business. And here's another photograph taken only 10 years after the first one. And look how many more employees there were then. And also examples of the scales that they were making at that time. And also towards the left-hand side, the family dog still appears in the picture. Now in 1907, my oldest uncle, John White, who was also called John White, he actually left and set up his own business. So he went across to Edinburgh, bought a foundry, and you'll see it says John White, late of Auchtermuchty. So he obviously wanted to perhaps expand the business even more, and decided that he'd rather do it on his own rather than working with the rest of the family. So he went off to Edinburgh and set up his own business in Edinburgh. In 1911, we have a copy of the Weights and Measures Inspector's Handbook, and there are 37 companies in the UK listed as weighing machine manufacturers. There are 3 in Scotland, and 2 of them are in Auchtermuchty, John White and Son, and another branch of the family called White Brothers. So Auchtermuchty definitely the centre of weighing in Scotland, if not elsewhere. During the First World War, we did a lot of work for the war effort, and this weighing machine was manufactured and supplied to the Woolwich Arsenal for weighing howitzer shells. The plate on the right has a groove in it where the shell would lie, and on the left the weights would be stacked up, so that we were ensuring that before the shells were sent off to the front that they were all properly made and weighed. I mentioned my Uncle John had gone off to Edinburgh, but he must have come back within the family fold, because this is a photograph showing him on the right-hand side at the back with my father and my other uncle at my grandfather's birthday. We think that's probably his 80th in 1918. Now, during the period between the wars, there was quite a lot of activity, again, expansion. We opened a branch in Edinburgh in 1919, which was actually based on what my Uncle John had been doing. And there was a shop in Victoria Street, which the family had until into the 1970s. Opened a branch in Glasgow in 1920, and the firm still has a branch in Glasgow now, but not on the same premises. In 1922, we opened our own iron foundry. Previously, we had obtained our castings from Robert Fairley and Sons Foundry, which had been established in Auchtermuchty in the 1870s. But in 1922, the firm opened its own iron foundry. So there you had in Auchtermuchty 2 iron foundries going at the same time. In 1929, we moved north with opening a branch in Forfar, because a lot of the scales that we made were sold to farms, and that was a great agricultural area, still is. In 1931, we opened a special department to make bottle moulds. And how this came about was we were making high quality iron castings, and in order to make glass bottles, you have a mould which is made of cast iron, and it's machined to the shape of the bottle. And we started supplying castings, and then the glass makers like Alloy Glass asked us to start machining them. So we opened a special department for that in 1931. Here's a catalogue from 1925, sectional catalogue number 28. We had different catalogues for different types of scales. This is the kind of machines that would have been in factories, etc. The interesting thing about this one is at the bottom you'll see it gives John Whitington Auchtermuchty, and it says Edinburgh, address in Victoria Street. On the right, Glasgow, address in Brown Street. And in the middle, there's a London office. So obviously we were selling goods well beyond Scotland at that time. I did a bit of research, and I discovered that 82 Victoria Street is now a modern shop in the Zara chain. So obviously the premises must have been rebuilt at some point. So I'm not quite sure what it looked like in those days. Those of you who are interested in transport, this is what you would have seen when John White and Son were out on the road. An interesting Bullnose Morris van, which was actually a converted open tourer, and the family still had the open tourer body, and at the weekend the van body would be taken off and the open tourer body would be put on, and the family could go away for a run and have a picnic. And then when it came back on Sunday night, the van body would be put back on ready for Monday morning. Here's some sort of scales that we're making. For example, a grocer's scale, 1935. That's a really fine example, that one. Price computing chart, a scoop for weighing the goods like vegetables, potatoes, etc., and a pan for the weights. And here's on the farm. Now, every farm had at least one set of scales, and most of these scales in Scotland came from Auchtermuchty. And you'll see that the chap on the right there is weighing a sack of tatties with a 56-pound weights on the back. And you'll see some photographs of this type of scale later on in the presentation. These are the two gentlemen who were running the business from really from the 20s right through until after the Second World War. My uncle, Andrew White, on the left, and my father, E.R., also Ted White, on the right. And here's a group of scale makers taken, we think, around 1935. 3 ladies in the middle of the picture, well represented, and the apprentices on the floor in the front. So that's a group of the staff in the 1930s. During the Second World War, more machines being made for the war effort. This is for, again, this scale is made entirely of aluminium, so that it's not going to cause any sparks for weighing armaments again. And Auchtermuchty was well served. We could supply scales anywhere in the country because we had a railway station on the Ladybank to Kinross line. And the Scammell lorry has just come in, picked up some scales and taken them down to the railway station. That picture would be taken early 40s, perhaps 1941 or so. And here's the staff in the foundry, just taken after the war, about 1947. a lot of the castings were made for other products, not just for weighing machines. So there in the front, there's a large cast iron wheel. And during the war, the foundry was making brake drums for the Spitfire and Hurricane fighters. 1949 now, and here's our stand at the Scottish Industries exhibition in the Kelvin Hall in Glasgow. And you'll see on the left, we've got some industrial scales, on the right, some retail scales, and in the back, the famous 1715 beam, proudly on display. And here we have some photographs from that period, pouring metal in the foundry from the furnace, in the machine shop, machining parts for weighing machines, assembling shop scales. That's on the upper floor. In fact, the part of that photograph was featured in the Scotsman vintage calendar a few years ago, showing the lady on the left, Chrissy Crichton, assembling a little scale there. In fact, Chrissy was the only lady in the factory for many, many years. Having had quite a few female colleagues during the war, after the war, she stayed on, and I think for about maybe 20 or more years, she was the only lady in the factory. And here's the scale under its final inspection by my cousin Henry White. You'll see he's inspecting little high accuracy beam scales there. And this is, I mentioned, bottle molds. There's a machining of the bottle mold part, and there's an example. It's a very, I think it was a jar that was filled with produce, and then when it was finished, you could use it as a flower vase. And that was part of the process that we did in the bottle mold department. And here's my father showing off the old beam to one of the younger girls. That's probably taken just after the war, when there were still a few more ladies in the factory. And we did a lot of exporting in the 50s and 60s. Here's an export consignment of 50 weighing machines, each one packed in a separate wooden crate. And that consignment was going off, I think, to Egypt. It was destined for Port Said in Egypt. And it was not only Egypt, there were many different countries that we exported to at that time. And because each country had its own denominations, we had to manufacture scales in each denomination. For the UK, our home market, we were in imperial system, hundredweights, quarters and pounds. Europe was metric, of course, in kilograms and grams. And the Commonwealth didn't use the imperial system, it used what was called the central system. So everything was measured in pounds. So it would be hundreds of pounds, 500 pounds, 1,000 pounds. Egypt and Cyprus used a designation called the oak. India had mons and seers. Burma had vis. Malaya had Chinese katis. And Peru had libra. So these are all the different denominations that the scales were manufactured in for export. And 1954, here's another stand at the second Scottish Industries exhibition. It's at the larger stand again, retail scales in the front, industrial scales in the back, including a couple of export models there. And again, the 1715 beam hanging at the back. And here's a photograph taken inside the weighing machine works in 1960. And you'll see weighing machines being assembled in the foreground, bench work on the left, and in the background, the machine shop where the parts were machined. And right in the center of the picture, the reason we know it was taken in 1960 is that the test weights that are used have got 60 stamped on them. So that was the machine shop and assembly shop on the ground floor of the factory. Now, this is an aerial view taken in 1963 when the factory was at its fullest extent. And there you can see the Burnside and Station Road in the foreground, the main building of the factory, and the extensions to the side. And at the back is the iron foundry, which extended really quite far back. And you'll see the furnace there and the chimney from the stoves. Other buildings, the engine house, the spray baths, the pattern shop, and all the other buildings. And the house, what were originally houses at the front, were the firm's offices. So that site extended to about 3 acres, and the factory was 25,000 square feet of productive space. at that time. And today, if you're driving through Auchtermuchty, the main part of the building has been conserved and is now a block of 12 flats called White's Way, which is another nice name to give it. So that's the main part of the building, which was in the previous slide. 1963-64, quite a few changes. The bottle mold department closed. The glass making companies started opening their own production facilities, and that trade declined, so we had to close that department. We actually purchased a second iron foundry in Tayport in 1963 and ran it for 5 years, but it wasn't as efficient as the Auchtermuchty one, so that was a rather short-lived time. We turned the division that ran the foundry into a limited company because previously the whole business had been a partnership, and we took on a non-family director to run the foundry division. And we designed our first checkware for the whisky industry in 1963, and this has gone on to be a key product for the company. As I said, we've dealt with the whisky industry over many years, and this was a departure and an important market for us starting in 1963. And in 1965, the company celebrated its 250th anniversary. This picture includes our local MP, Sir John Gilmore, the Provost of Auchtermuchty, Jim Patterson, and the Lord Lieutenant of Fife, John McWilliam, as well as members of the family, including my uncle, Andrew, whom you saw earlier in the photograph. He's sitting in the centre. That's me, I think, back left. 65-73, more developments. We turned the weighing machine division into a separate company. We took on a non-family director on the board of the weighing machine company. We started electronic developments from about 1970, when weighing was changing from mechanical. And these developments were led by my brother, John White, who was actually a mechanical engineer at the start of his training, but he learned about electronics when he was dealing with radar during his national service in the army. An important milestone, February 71, anybody remember decimalisation taking place? And the VAT came in, the dreaded VAT came in 1973. And this is George Sanderson, our non-family director, whose father had been the manager of the foundry. And George served his time as a weighing machine engineer, went off and ran our Glasgow branch for many years, and then came back as sales director in the 70s. And we started computing in 1973 with a Burroughs machine, early visible record computer, no screen in those days, but it was actually doing the analysis using paper tape punch and reader for data analysis. So that was what we started our computerization in 1973. The next stage, 75-80, we opened a branch in Aberdeen. This was the start of the oil industry. And our very first sale was to Shell. We sold them a bathroom scale to weigh drill bits. And since then, we've developed very strong links with the oil industry and its support network in the north of Scotland, up in Shetland as well. We closed our iron foundry in 1977 because we were using less and less castings in making weighing machines, and electronics was coming in, and the other markets for cast iron were declining as well. So we closed the foundry in 1977. We started investing in microprocessor development from that time, because that's obviously where the future was going to be. And we closed our Edinburgh branch in 1978. It was much easier to get across to Edinburgh after the fourth road bridge opened in the 60s. So by 78, we realised we could service that area quite adequately from Fife. And we concluded the last mechanical scale production in 1979. And that's when we went wholly electronic. And we registered a new company, Weighing Automation Limited, in 1980 to take that development forward. And the checkware, what we call our Cartomat checkware, the first all-electronic one, was launched in 1980. And this is a photograph taken at the Aberdeen branch, the sales director and the branch manager at the opening of our Aberdeen branch in 1975. And here's another aerial view of the factory taken in 1979. This is after the Foundry had closed, and there's not quite so much activity at the back. It's just another view, and you can see the main part of the building, which is now White's Way, and the buildings beside it have been taken down, and just a little cottage and a two-storey house remaining on the street. And this is taken around the back of the foundry, showing the furnace and the crane we use to unload and load. And here's some of the electronic products that we made in the 1980s. That's the electronic checkware, and that's a batchware which is used for multi-material processing. And that's the reject unit that we started working with the checkware in the whisky industry. So here we have a picture which shows 265 years of state-of-the-art weighing technology. I mentioned that the first weighing machine that my five-times great-grandfather made was 1715 on it, and it was actually a very advanced design in its day. So here we have a very advanced design from 1715 alongside a very advanced design in 1980. And that's my brother John White on the left, showing a printed circuit board, and in between us is the weighing beam from 1715. And since 1996, there've been more developments. We bought new premises in Auchtermuchty after the factory closed, because obviously with electronics you don't need all that space that we used to have. So we now have premises in the back dikes in Auchtermuchty. We have this lady called Joyce who joined the business as our general manager in 1997. And we carried out a strategic business review to find out which way the company was going. We achieved investors in people. Again, being a family business, our staff have always been very important. This was a accreditation highlighting that important aspect of the business. And we started developing links with quite a lot of the Scottish universities, particularly Strathclyde, Herrick-Watt and Robert Gordon's, as well as a few others as well. And we started designing some new products to establish John White & Son as a key player in the weighing industry. And here's some of the things that we were doing in 2015 on our 300th anniversary. This is the illustration on the left is one of a set of 5 weighbridges that we installed. AWPR was the Aberdeen Western Peripheral route, and they had to weigh all the earth and gravel and stones that they were moving around the sites. And so we had 5 new weighbridges that we installed around the outskirts of Aberdeen. And we also supplied a lot of new equipment to the whisky industry, Diageo, Chivas, White Mackay and Glenmorangie. I think the photograph on the right is at Glenmorangie in Livingston. And we reached 300 years, and we had a little party. So this is we invited some old employees, former employees that we're still in touch with. And the oldest one there was, I think, 94. And the youngest one is 26 in that photograph. So that was a nice way to celebrate 300 years locally. The setting, for those of you who know Auchtermuchty, you'll recognise the bowling green. And going into the future, 2017, the family sold the business to Joyce, who had come in quite a few years earlier, and she's built up a strong management team to take the company forward into the future. And that means that it's going to be secure as an independent company, and it's aiming to be a significant player in international markets. And this is already happening. There's an illustration of the sort of technology that we're working with in 2021. This is a new installation at Chivas Brothers in Dumbarton. Again, whisky industry, very important to the company. So that brings us over 300 years and counting, up to date. And when I finished this presentation, I realized that because this is being given in a heritage context, you'll probably be interested in some of the things that happen because of the fact that John White & Son is still around after all these years. People Google White or John White, Auchtermuchty, and they find that we're still here. So they send us emails from all over the world saying that they've got this scale or that scale. What can we tell them about it? So I'm now going to run through a few of the historical scales that have turned up in different parts of the world in recent years. First of all, we have a beam scale, which is hanging in, used to hang in the docks in San Francisco for weighing bales. And a local resident rescued it, and it now hangs in his garage. So we were able to tell him exactly what it was and when it was made and everything. So that one's in San Francisco. Here's one that's actually local. Archibald Findlay was a noted potato breeder who originally came from Markinch. Some of you in the Heritage Group will know all about him. He then bought a farm in Auchtermuchty, Maresland Farm, and he had a warehouse, which is the building where these photographs have been taken. And again, showing the scale for weighing potatoes on the right-hand side there. It's very clear, John White & Son scale for weighing. Some of the varieties he developed: Majestic, Divernon, Katrina and Eldorado on the left there. In fact, quite a significant percentage of the potatoes produced anywhere in the world now are descended from the stock that Archibald Findlay developed in Markinch and Auchtermuchty. Now, this is a customer contact who sent in these photographs saying that they'd acquired a scale. They wanted to know more about it, and they then went away and restored it. It looks actually quite good, but look at this. Fantastic. Finishing it off. A really smart scale. And that would have been used for weighing coal sacks hanging on the back of the lorry, and the two long hooks would be attached to the coal sack, which meant that the coal could be weighed in the presence of the householder before it was tipped into the coal cellar. You may have caught sight of a machine like this in one of the earlier photographs showing all the staff. This is not a weighing machine, but it's a Victor corking machine, and that's to put the crown corks on bottles. And it was obviously a product that was quite successful in late Victorian times. And the one that's shown on the right, somebody down in, I think it's near Dunfermline, they've actually got one and they've restored it, and it looks quite splendid there. So you sat on the seat, you put your bottle on the stand, put the top on it, pulled the lever, and pressed the cork, the crown cork onto the bottle. Here's a lovely brass beam scale, which is now in St. Louis, Missouri. You'll see it's got a lovely china plate with John White & Son on it, and a really complete masterpiece from the factory, survived to the present day. And a similar one, and this one's in Asheville, North Carolina. Again, a complete beam scale with another china plate with a different logo on, showing the beam as part of our emblem, like a coat of arms. This one is in Victoria in Australia. On the left is the photograph of the scale, which is actually a postal scale. And on the right, you'll recognize the photograph that I showed earlier, my cousin Henry White inspecting scales. And it's exactly the same model in that picture as the one that's now out in Australia. And that was a letter balance for weighing letters in small parcels for the post. Now, this has got an interesting history. A gentleman from Epstein in Germany sent us details of this scale, which he said he purchased in Karachi in Pakistan. So again, it's a beam scale, and I was able to send him a copy of the photograph of the catalogue where the scale was shown in the late Victorian times. And here's a scale which is still in use today at Fettercairn Distillery, which is owned by White & Mackay. And on the left, you'll see the manager of the distillery, who's now retired, David Doig. He was the one that used to sign all the labels on the bottles to authenticate the Fettercairn malt whisky. But that scale was sold by and installed by John White & Son in 1946, and it's still in use, and it's been under contract to John White & Son since it was new. and it's still working and it's still accurate. And here's a recent restoration. Somebody sent in a photograph of a scale. Again, this is a potato bean scale, which potato sack scale, and you see a really nice job they've done on the right. A very nice finish, and a lovely green color. And here's another one which was in even worse condition, and look how it's turned out. More being used as a garden ornament than a weighing machine, but very nice indeed. And they've highlighted the lettering with John Whiteson on it in yellow, which shows it off very well. So it's nice to receive things like that, to see that people still appreciate these old scales. We weren't just scale makers; we did other things with metal. And this was discovered. These two bells in Monomail Parish Church were discovered in 2014 when Edinburgh University were doing a survey, and it's got J. White and Son Auchtermuchty 1893. And what we don't know is if they were cast in Auchtermuchty or whether they were cast elsewhere with our name on them. But interesting to know that we're actually doing church bells. Now, this is a very interesting story. Some of you may know or have heard of a village called Inverie in the Knoydart Peninsula. It's a place you can't get to by road. You've got to go by boat or overland, where there's no road. And in Inverie, there's an old John White and Son weighing machine. It's a Model 52 cart weighbridge from around 1900 or perhaps slightly earlier. What you can see there is the plate in the ground, surrounded by the grass, and the indicating steelyard in the back against the wall. And there's the catalogue entry for that scale from Catalogue of 1895. Self-contained weighbridge for two-wheeled carts, and the long steelyard for the weighing beam. And this scale, there it is there, the plate, John White, J. White and Son Auchtermuchty, and the head of the steelyard there. And this scale was used by the estate to weigh carts of coal, which were delivered by puffer and loaded into carts. The cart would then go onto the weighbridge, be weighed, and then it was taken round the estate, and the correct amount of coal was delivered to all the families on the estate. And here we are, back to where it all began in Auchtermuchty. Thank you very much. Now, if any of you have any questions, or if you've got any other information about John White and Son that you think perhaps we might not have heard of, please do get in touch. And there's my email address. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed that talk.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you very much for that. That was most interesting, and I'm sure very difficult to try and compress, over 300 years of history into a short talk like that. So for folks who are watching, Ted has kindly put his email address on that slide there. So if you have any questions or questions that occur to you later, then as I say, Ted has kindly agreed that he'll field any questions, by email like that. But if you've logged in just now and you have any questions, then just type them up there, and I'll get Ted to answer them. Meantime, there's a few questions that I have actually. You mentioned the railway, but of course the firm was in existence long before the railway arrived. Do you know from the records what kind of radius or what kind of limit there was to the distance that machines would be ordered and delivered, due to just the transport conditions?
Well, certainly in the 18th century, it would have been mostly Fife. But I think by the 19th century, some of the books that we have show that scales were going to Aberdeen, to Wick, so really all over Scotland. And then once the railways came, then obviously they could go anywhere. So we had agents in like Dundee. People like ironmongers would sell scales, so local shops could go to their local ironmonger and buy a John White and Son scale. And we had an agent in Aberdeen, I think, as well. And obviously the family was well connected with the iron founding industry in Scotland, so there were customers through, particularly in the west of Scotland. So we obviously managed without the railway. It was interesting how they actually shipped things around in those days.
Mm. And given that obviously Auchtermuchty is not quite in the sort of the industrial heartland or the typical industrial heartland, were there ever any competitors that were sort of local or localish?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, there was a branch of the family ran a separate business called White Brothers, and that was in Auchtermuchty, and then it moved to Glasgow, I think in about the 1930s. But in terms of other scale makers, not so much locally. There were scale makers in Glasgow, in Aberdeen and Dundee, other names like Collins in Aberdeen, Shuttleworth in Dundee, and there were several in the Glasgow area. So yeah, there were competitors. But the fact that it was in Auchtermuchty, I think, is just in a sense a historical accident, that the first John White, who was obviously a blacksmith, must have trained, and we think possibly he'd actually trained in Holland or Germany to learn how to turn his blacksmithing skills into making weighing machines, because that example that we have, which obviously wasn't the first attempt, was actually a fairly new design that was only introduced at the beginning of the 18th century. So these are links that we still have to follow through and try and establish if there's any records of that. And
so the likes of say obviously there was the firm Henry Pulley and Son, and they were founded later, I think about 75 years after your own firm.
Yeah.
They became one of the largest manufacturers of weighing machines. I mean, what sort of impact did that have on the business?
Well, the two main firms, and in fact latterly they were all part of the same firm, Avery, which is a name that most people will associate with weighing, W&T Avery of Birmingham, and they actually bought Henry Pulley and Sons. So most of the industrial weighing machines that you would see, for example, in railway stations up and down the country, were either Avery or Pulley. And Pulley had a branch in Glasgow, I think it was quite a small factory. So yes, there was competition, but obviously we kept abreast of the technical developments, and our equipment was on a par with anything else that was produced elsewhere. And latterly, the Avery policy was they bought over certain companies like Pulley and so on, and they kept these names going separately, so that if people were buying a scale from, say, Pulley, they didn't realize that it was just buying it from Avery. And these companies, which were part of the Avery network, were allowed to source their machines elsewhere. So John White and Son was making scales for 3 or 4 Avery subsidiaries, badging them up with the names of the subsidiaries, who then sold them in competition with Avery. So if anyone ever finds a scale with some of these other names like Ashworth Ross or Bering Warmington, on the blade, it doesn't say John White and Son, but there's a red lion rampant. So any scale with a red lion rampant on it is actually made in Auchtermuchty by John White and Son. So that was an interesting way of getting a share of the market from your competitor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was something I certainly wasn't aware of that. And you mentioned Avery there, and yes, of course, they did swallow up quite a number of rival firms. Did they ever come after John White and Son to take over?
Frequently, yes, frequently. We had the managing director of Avery at our 250th anniversary, and they gave us a very nice presentation, but they were never able to buy the business. The family just wanted to be independent, and because if you sell out to like a big international operation like that, then you just become they're just buying it for the customers. They're not interested in in the whole aspect of the business. So our main objective has always been to be an independent business, and even if it's not now owned by the White family, it'll still be an independent business going forward.
And I mean that's quite a rare thing nowadays. Let's face it. At one time, yeah, family businesses were quite normal, quite the norm. But yes, it's even an independent business can be quite hard to find nowadays, because they generally are just taken over, and as people seem to kind of gravitate towards, conglomerates, whether it's Starbucks or, it's just some names just kind of become synonymous with a particular product. And I think it's increasingly difficult for the independent retailer, wholesaler, manufacturer, whatever. So it's great that that's managed to continue.
Yes, I think there's been a move, actually, particularly during the pandemic, where local businesses have actually been able to attract customers, because people are saying, shop local, go to your local shop, buy goods from the farm. You don't need to go to the supermarket, this sort of thing. So I think there's a general trend that people like to go local if they can.
One other thing that occurred to me, and that's really around personal weighing machines. I mean, it may be that John White and Son now focus entirely on the industrial side. So that's kind of one question. But the fact that there's that boom around health and so on, has that created a rise in demand for personal weighing machines?
There's certainly yes. The regulation of weighing for patients in the health sector is now very regulated. So that's a big market. But there's actually two companies who have more or less got a monopoly of that, because these scales have to be made in quite high volumes. It doesn't lend itself to being done with a smaller company like John White and Son, because our products are pretty specialized, and we don't mass produce anything, because the economies of scale are not there for the volumes that we could produce. So most of the scales in the health sector are made by one or other of two different manufacturers, one of whom is German.
Yeah, that's again, that's I remember, of course, that you made scales for the slimming industry at one point. But again, I suppose it's the question of volume, really, that impacts there.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, technically, we were capable of designing and producing scales, and my brother was fantastic at producing the technical specification and the product. But in order to get the economies of scale, we would have had to ramp up production, and then companies that have tried to do that have found that you can't get the cost down, and so a lot of stuff that's made that way is made in the Far East, in Japan or China or Korea. So it's difficult to compete on that level. But certainly, John White and Son has always worked directly with customers, and a lot of the equipment that we produce nowadays is custom made for particular applications for particular customers.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't see any questions in the chat there, Ted. So I think we'll just kind of wind it up at that, and just thank you once again. And if you could just hang back after I end the broadcast. But thank you very much again, and obviously those who are watching, apologies for the delay. But if you have missed it, you'll be able to see it on our YouTube channel anyway. But thank you again, Ted, and good night, everybody, just now. And I hope to see you for the November talk.